my own son called me useless and left me in a nursing home. But he had no idea that just weeks before, I inherited $3.7 million from my late boss. The words are still burned into my memory because they did not come from the mouth of a stranger on the street or from someone who never knew me. They came from the very person I had carried for 9 months, the one I held close when he was small, the boy I once thought was the purest gift of my life. To be told by him that I was nothing more than a burden was like being struck in the chest. And then, before I could even process that sting, he made a decision for me. A decision that would define me as weak, powerless, and disposable. He signed me into a nursing home as though I were a package to be dropped off. I sat on that narrow bed with the thin blanket, staring at the grey walls that would now become my prison. And I asked myself the same question I now ask you. What would you do if your own blood abandoned you, convinced you had nothing left to give? People imagine that betrayal is something you can prepare for, but you never can. Not when it comes from the child you raised, the one whose scraped knees you bandaged, whose meals you cooked, whose tears you wiped away long before they learned to speak in full sentences. I gave him my life, and in return, he gave me a sentence. But here is what he never saw, what he never even considered. Just weeks before this betrayal, I had stood in a lawyer's office, listening to words that would forever change my destiny. My late boss, a man I had worked for faithfully for decades, had left me everything. $3.7 million. He called me loyal, dependable, the backbone of his household and business. And so, in his will, he made me an heir. Imagine sitting in silence with a secret so heavy and so bright, knowing the very people who dismissed you would soon learn the weight of their mistake. The irony was almost too much to bear. Here I was, treated as if I had no value, no future, no independence, while in truth I had the power to choose any path I wanted. And yet I stayed silent. Why? Because sometimes silence reveals more than shouting ever could. I wanted to see the truth of his heart. I wanted to watch, unmasked, what he really thought of me when he believed I was poor, helpless, and without options. I wanted to know what loyalty looked like when no inheritance dangled in the distance, when love had to stand on its own. Do you know what it feels like to be written off, to be pushed aside, to be told that your season is over? To be treated like yesterday's news while you are still breathing, still thinking, still alive with dreams? That was my reality. And perhaps that is why you are still listening to me now, because you have tasted something similar. You know the ache of being underestimated, the cruelty of being laughed at or ignored, the sting of being treated as though your worth expired years ago. If this story touches something deep inside you, I ask you gently to like this video and subscribe, because messages like this need to reach the ones who feel invisible, the ones who believe their story is already over. But it isn't. Not for me, not for you. So I invite you to stay with me until the end, because this isn't simply about revenge or money. This is about dignity. This is about finding the strength to stand tall when the world tries to shrink you. And before we continue, I want to leave you with a question that will sit heavy in your mind until we return. If you were given the chance to rewrite your story, to turn the very betrayal meant to destroy you into the fire that set you free, would you take it? Tell me in the comments, because your answer might just be the beginning of your transformation. When I think back on my life, it doesn't start with the betrayal. It starts with mornings long before the sun rose, when the alarm clock would ring in that tiny house I worked so hard to keep. I would slip out of bed quietly so my son could sleep a little longer, because even as a child he needed his rest. And I believed it was my duty to carry the weight of the world so he could dream freely. My job wasn't glamorous. For over 35 years I was a domestic worker and later a secretary for the same family, the family of the man who eventually left me his fortune. But back then, all I had were hands that never stopped moving, scrubbing floors, ironing clothes until my knuckles cracked, organizing files until my eyes blurred from the tiny letters. I learned to move like a shadow, present, essential, but almost invisible. My routine was a song of sacrifice. I would prepare their breakfast before the first light, set their table with precision, and then rush across town to punch the clock in his office, where I balanced his schedule, typed his letters, and managed the details of his life so he could build his empire. And when my workday ended, my second shift began at home. Dinner for my boy, laundry piled high, bills to stretch until the end of the month. I became an artist of survival, finding ways to make one chicken feed us for 3 days, patching the same pair of shoes so he wouldn't feel embarrassed at school. The house was small, the walls thin, but within them I poured all my love. There were nights when exhaustion pressed so heavily on me that I thought I might not wake up the next morning. But then I would hear the sound of his breathing in the next room, steady and safe. And I reminded myself why I was fighting. Every decision, every sacrifice was for him. I refused to let him grow up feeling the hunger I had felt as a child. I told myself over and over, if I give him everything, he would never feel small. He will never feel less than. I still remember the smell of that old house, faintly of detergent and dust, with the squeak of the floorboards under my tired feet. The photographs on the wall were few, mostly faded pictures taken, with borrowed cameras. And even in those rare photographs, it was always him in the center, smiling, shining, the promise of a better future. I was almost never in the frame. I thought that was love, keeping myself behind the lens so he could shine in front of it. But now, with years between those moments and the woman I have become, I ask myself if disappearing from my own story was the beginning of the mistake. The contrast of my world was always striking. By day, I moved through spaces of wealth and comfort, polishing silver that wasn't mine, typing reports that built fortunes I would never spend. Then I would return to my modest home, with its cracked walls and second-hand furniture, carrying groceries in paper bags that seemed too heavy for one person. My hands, tired and raw, would still cook, still clean, still comfort a boy who thought his mother's arms were the safest place on earth. And he was right. I made it that way. I gave him everything. I worked through illness, through storms, through loneliness. I was there at every school recital, even if it meant running from work in wrinkled clothes. I clapped the loudest when he walked across the stage with his little certificate, because to me, his success was the proof that my sacrifices had meaning. I didn't care if I ate less, if I wore the same coat for 10 winters, if I never once took a vacation. Every cent I earned was split between survival and his dreams. I told myself that one day he would look back and say, "My mother carried me, and I honor her for it." But now, sitting in the quiet of this home for the elderly, I replay those sacrifices in my mind and wonder if giving everything was my greatest mistake. Did I love him so much that I forgot to teach him how to love me back? Did I protect him so fiercely that he never learned what it cost me? Maybe by handing him everything, I raised a man who believed I was meant to be used, to be discarded once I no longer served his convenience. The irony is sharp, almost cruel. I built my life around service to my boss, to his family, to my own son, and now those years of loyalty are the very reason I stand with power no one expects. My late boss saw me, truly saw me, even if my own blood did not. He understood the backbone it takes to hold everything together quietly, and that is why he left me his legacy. But before we get there, I want to leave you with this reflection, because I believe it matters for every person listening. How many of you have given so much that you no longer know where you end and where your sacrifice begins? How many of you have loved so hard, worked so tirelessly, that the people you serve stopped seeing you as a person and only saw what you could provide? Tell me in the comments. Have you ever looked back and realized you disappeared in your own story just to keep someone else's world intact. The signs were not sudden. They crept in quietly, like shadows at the edges of a room you think is safe. At first, I told myself it was just part of growing up. That distance between a mother and her son was natural. He had his own life, his own friends, his own ambitions. But somewhere along the line, the warmth between us shifted into something cold, something conditional, as though I existed only when I could give him something he wanted. He stopped calling just to hear my voice. The phone would ring only when he needed money. Sometimes it was for bills he had forgotten, other times for opportunities that he swore would change his life forever. "Just a loan, Mom," he would say, promising to repay me once his luck turned around. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that a son raised with so much love could never take advantage of his own mother. But the truth settled in like a stone in my chest each time the days passed and the promises dissolved into silence. Not one of those loans ever came back. And then came the birthdays. I stopped counting how many times I sat in my chair, waiting for a phone call that never came. I baked my own small cake once, thinking maybe I could turn the loneliness into celebration, but even as I sliced it, the silence felt heavier than hunger. I told myself he must have been busy, maybe working, maybe distracted, but when I looked later at his social media, there were smiling photos with friends, dinners in restaurants, drinks raised in toasts. My name wasn't in any caption. My day wasn't even a footnote in his life. Little by little, the humiliations piled up. They weren't loud or violent. They were sharp, quiet cuts, the kind that leave scars no one else can see. He would glance at my house and say things like, "This place looks like it belongs in another century." He would laugh at the wallpaper, the creaky floors, the way I still kept the same curtains from decades ago. "You really should sell this place, Mom," he'd say, as if the walls that sheltered him through childhood meant nothing more than a crumbling shell. I heard the disdain in his voice when he called me old-fashioned, as if age was a crime, as if the years of sacrifice had erased my worth instead of proving it. Sometimes, in gatherings with his friends, I would overhear his jokes. "My mom doesn't really get technology," he'd say, dismissing me with a laugh, turning my lack of apps and gadgets into entertainment for others. He thought it was harmless teasing. He didn't see the way it made me feel small, reduced to a caricature of ignorance, as if the wisdom of decades could be dismissed because I didn't carry the latest phone in my pocket. I wanted to remind him that while he played with his games as a boy, I was the one who balanced the bills, who kept the lights on, who made sure there was always food on the table. But the words stuck in my throat because somewhere deep inside, I still wanted to protect him from the truth of his cruelty. The most painful part wasn't his forgetfulness or his careless words. It was the realization that he no longer saw me as a person with a story, with value, with dignity. To him, I had become a bank account with thinning hair, a driver when his car was in the shop, a cook when he wanted a taste of home. I was useful only in my utility, invisible when I needed love. And I began to ask myself questions that tore at the very core of who I was. At what point do children forget who raised them? When does a son stop seeing the mother who held him through storms and start seeing only the inconvenience of her aging body, her simple home, her slowing steps? I would lie awake at night, listening to the creaks of the old house, the same sounds that once comforted me, and now all I heard was his criticism echoing in my mind. I wondered if all those years of sacrifice had taught him to expect me to give endlessly without ever teaching him gratitude. Was I the one who created this distance by pouring myself so completely into him that he believed I had no life beyond what I could give to him? Did I vanish so thoroughly into his needs that he forgot I was a woman before I was ever his mother? The truth is, I didn't stop loving him. I couldn't. Love like mine doesn't fade. But I began to see that love without respect is a cage. And I was trapped in a cycle where my giving was no longer seen as love, but as obligation. As if he were entitled to my sacrifices simply because I was his mother. That realization cut deeper than any cruel word. Because what does it mean when your own child sees you not as a person to be cherished, but as a resource to be drained? I look back now and see those early signs so clearly, though at the time I brushed them aside. I told myself he was young, stressed, distracted. But the truth is, he was learning how to treat me by the way I allowed myself to be treated. And by the time I saw it for what it was, the distance between us was already a canyon. Tell me in the comments, have you ever realized too late that the people you gave everything to stopped seeing you as human and only saw you as what you could provide? I will never forget the day he walked in holding those glossy pamphlets. They were colorful, cheerful even, filled with staged photographs of smiling elderly people sitting in spotless gardens, as if loneliness could be hidden behind well-trimmed hedges. He dropped them on my table like they were the solution to a problem he didn't even bother to ask me about. His words cut colder than any winter wind I had ever felt. "Mum, it's safer for you there. You can't live alone anymore." I looked at him, searching his face for hesitation, for warmth, for any trace of the boy who once clung to my leg at school drop-off, crying because he didn't want to leave me. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man with eyes that refused to meet mine, a man rehearsing lines he had already convinced himself were justified. He spoke with the voice of someone making a business transaction, not a son, speaking to the woman who gave him life. As he slid the brochures closer, I saw his hands, steady, confident, and completely detached. He had already chosen 3 options for me, circled in pen. Affordable, mid-range, and premium, he called them, as if I were shopping for furniture and not being told I was no longer welcome in my own home. Each description talked about safety, community, care. Not one word said love. My chest tightened, not just with anger, but with the unbearable weight of memory. In that moment, I wasn't staring at pamphlets. I was staring at years of sacrifice flashing in my mind. I saw myself walking home in the pouring rain, soaked to the bone because I had saved the bus fare so I could buy him new shoes. I saw the nights I stayed awake sewing his costumes for school plays, making sure he felt proud standing on that stage. I saw myself sitting in hospital waiting rooms, clutching my hands until they hurt, whispering prayers that he would recover from childhood fevers. All those moments when I thought love would be enough to ensure I was never discarded. All those years, I believed my sacrifices were investments in a bond that would last forever. But now, I realized he didn't see me as his foundation. He saw me as his burden. His words, meant to sound reasonable, carried an unspoken message. "You're in the way." He didn't talk about my health, my wishes, or my dignity. He talked about convenience, about safety, about responsibility shifted away from him. And when I asked, my voice trembling, "Why now? Why this?" he gave me the answer that shattered whatever illusions I had left. "I've already had the house appraised, Mom. It's better this way. You'll be taken care of, and the place won't go to waste. Do you know what it feels like when the ground disappears beneath you?" That sentence was the hole opening under my feet. The home I had worked my entire life to maintain, the walls that had heard my prayers and my laughter, the kitchen, where I fed him with meals cooked on stretched budgets. That home was nothing more to him than property, numbers on paper, a transaction waiting to happen. He had already taken steps, made calls, calculated values. My life wasn't a life in his eyes. It was an asset to be liquidated. I sat in silence while he went on about logistics, deposits, and moving dates. His words blurred as rage and heartbreak fought inside me. I studied his face, searching for guilt, but there was none. He had already convinced himself he was right, that he was doing the responsible thing. I wanted to shout, to throw those pamphlets across the room, to make him see me, not as a line item, not as a problem to be solved, but as his mother, the woman who had given up everything so he could stand where he was. But the words stuck in my throat, too heavy, too poisoned by disbelief. It was then that I understood something that still makes my chest ache. Gratitude cannot be forced. Love cannot be demanded. You can raise a child with every ounce of your soul, and still he can grow into someone who looks at you as disposable. That realization is the deepest kind of betrayal, because it tells you that everything you gave may never come back to you. I picked up one of the brochures and stared at the image on the cover, an elderly woman smiling as if she were content. I wondered if she was real, if she was truly happy, or if she too had been placed there by someone who found her inconvenient. I imagined myself in that picture, smiling to cover the sting of rejection, sitting in a chair that wasn't mine, surrounded by strangers, while the son I gave my life to enjoyed the comfort of the home he stole from me. The silence between us was suffocating. He misread it as compliance, as surrender. He took my lack of words as agreement, as if the mother who once carried him on her back would bow quietly to his decision. But inside me, something was shifting. Something that had been silent for too long began to stir. And as I sat there, drowning in the cruelty of the moment, I thought to myself, would I ever forgive him for this? Could I ever erase the sting of being treated like a burden by the very person who should have carried me with honor in my later years? Now I turn that question to you. Tell me, would you ever forgive your child for treating you like a burden? The first night in the nursing home felt like being erased. The room was small, barely large enough for a bed, a chair, and a dresser. The walls were a bland beige that seemed designed to flatten any spark of personality. The air carried a faint but constant smell of disinfectant, sharp and sterile, as if cleanliness could mask the emptiness. The bed creaked when I lay down, its thin mattress a cruel downgrade from the one I had worked decades to afford. Dinner had been a lukewarm tray of mashed potatoes and overcooked vegetables. Food meant to fill the stomach, but not nourish the soul. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the plastic cup of water by my side, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had disappeared into nothingness. During the days, I walked the hallways slowly, passing door after door that looked just like mine. Sometimes I would hear television laughter muffled from behind those doors, sometimes the hum of medical machines. In the communal dining area, I met women whose stories echoed mine in ways that broke and bound me. There was Margaret, whose daughter dropped her off with the words, "You'll make new friends here?" There was Ruth, who had sold her house at her son's insistence, only to learn he had gambled away the money. And there was Joan, who still wore the wedding ring from a husband long gone, and cried quietly when she thought no one was watching. We talked in fragments, pieces of our lives spilling out between bites of tasteless meals. Each story was a mirror reflecting my own pain back at me. We were women who had raised children, kept homes alive, given decades of labor and love. And now we were the forgotten, hidden away where no one had to confront the cost of their ingratitude. It comforted me to know I wasn't alone, but it also cut deeper, realizing how many of us had been pushed aside by the very people we had sacrificed everything for. At night, the silence pressed harder. Lying in the narrow bed, I could hear the faint groans of the building settling, the footsteps of nurses making their rounds, the occasional cry of someone who had lost their way even in their dreams. I would close my eyes, but the memories came uninvited. I remembered my husband's voice, steady and kind, telling me once that as long as we had each other, we had everything. I remembered the way he would hold my hand when life felt overwhelming, and how his presence alone made me believe I could face anything. But he was gone, and the empty side of the bed mocked me with its cold sheets. Then came the memories of my son as a boy. His laughter in the backyard, the way he used to run into my arms after school, The nights I stayed awake sewing clothes for him or counting pennies to make sure there was enough for his school trip. I would hear his childhood voice in my mind, calling me Mommy. And then I would hear his grown-up voice from just weeks before, cold and detached. You can't live alone anymore. I cried into my pillow, the tears soaking the thin fabric because the contrast was unbearable. How could the same boy who once clung to me now discard me like an old coat he no longer needed? And yet, even in that darkness, a flicker of something stirred. It came in the form of a memory. Not of my son, not of my husband, but of my late employer. I remembered the day he looked me in the eye, his voice unusually serious. "You've been more than an employee," he had said. "You've been family." At the time, I brushed it off as kindness, a polite way to acknowledge my decades of service. But then I remembered the letter from the lawyer, the testament he left behind, the unbelievable truth that I had inherited $3.7 million. It felt almost surreal, like a secret the universe had been keeping for me until I needed it most. I hadn't thought much about that inheritance when the news first came, because grief had clouded everything. My boss had been a constant presence in my working life, and his passing left a hole I wasn't ready to fill with financial matters. But now, sitting in that sterile room, I realized that his last act of generosity might be the very key to my freedom. He had seen value in me when my own son did not. He had entrusted me with something that could not only change my circumstances, but also remind me that I was not invisible, not useless, not disposable. I began to think differently about my situation. The tears that stained my pillow slowly turned into sparks of defiance. Perhaps this was where my story would change. Perhaps this small, suffocating room was not the end, but the beginning of something I had never dared to claim before, my independence. The loneliness was still there, the ache of betrayal still sharp, but under it all was the whisper of possibility. I told myself that if my own blood could treat me like a burden, then maybe it was time to stop living for his approval. Maybe it was time to live for myself, with the dignity and power that my late boss had reminded me I still possessed. That inheritance wasn't just money. It was recognition. It was a statement that my life, my work, my presence had mattered. As I lay awake that night, the ceiling above me blurred by tears, I asked myself a question that I now ask you. If life suddenly handed you the power to rewrite your story, would you take it? Or would you stay quiet in the place where others have tried to bury you? The day I decided to stop hiding my secret was not planned. It wasn't written on any calendar or marked by some dramatic thunderstorm outside the window. It happened on an ordinary afternoon in the nursing home, when the smell of disinfectant was the same as always, when the hallway echoed with the squeak of nurses' shoes and the distant hum of a television. But inside me, something shifted. I was tired of shrinking. Tired of watching the boy I raised strut through life as if I owed him my silence. Tired of pretending I had nothing when, in truth, I had been given more than I ever imagined. $3.7 million. That number still makes me catch my breath. Not because of greed, but because of what it meant. It was proof. Proof that someone had seen me, valued me, trusted me enough to leave me not scraps, but the entirety of what he built. My late boss had called me family, and in the end, he treated me better than my own blood. I remember the day I first heard the news from the lawyer. I sat across the desk, my hands folded tightly in my lap, thinking I must have misheard. I was a housekeeper, a secretary, a woman who had filed receipts, cleaned floors, scheduled appointments, and kept a household running with quiet diligence. Never once did I imagine I would be written into a will. But my boss had thought differently. He had seen the long nights, the loyalty, the sacrifices no one else noticed. He had recognized me. and in his final act he placed his trust in me, leaving me $3.7 million. It wasn't just an inheritance, it was a declaration. You mattered. I didn't tell my son right away. Some people would have shouted it from the rooftops, but not me. I wanted to know who he truly was, without the promise of money dangling in front of him. I wanted to see his heart when he thought I was powerless, when he believed I was dependent on his mercy. And what I saw was uglier than I had feared. He abandoned me here, in this sterile place, as though I were a box to be checked off his to-do list. He looked me in the eye and called me a burden, not knowing I had the power to change both of our lives with a single signature. That was when I knew. This fortune would not go to him. I would use it, yes, but not for him. For me. For my dignity. For my freedom. For the life I had thought was already over. Weeks passed, and he didn't visit. Not once. The only calls I received were from the staff, telling me about his paperwork, his inquiries about my house, his attempts to move forward with selling the place that still smelled like my husband's aftershave. Each update cut into me, but each one also steeled my resolve. He thought I was finished, tucked away and forgotten. But he had no idea that I was just beginning. Then, one afternoon, he appeared. He walked into the nursing home with that confident stride, holding more papers under his arm. His face was set in a half-smile, the kind you wear when you think you're in control of everything. He sat across from me, the smell of his cologne filling the room, and without preamble he began speaking about arrangements, about how it was best for me to stay here long-term, how the house was too much for me, how he had found interested buyers. He spoke as if I were a shadow in the room, a formality to be handled. And that was when I slid the envelope across the table. He picked it up, expecting it to be the signature he wanted. Perhaps the deed, perhaps consent, perhaps a surrender. But when he opened it, his eyes froze. Inside was not his triumph, but my truth. The official documents from the lawyer confirming the inheritance, the testament that named me the sole beneficiary, and the updated will I had signed just days earlier. My voice was calm, steady, and sharper than any shout could have been. This is what you never bothered to ask about. This is what I chose to keep to myself while you decided I was worthless. And this, I said, pointing to the last page, is where you learn that not 1 cent of this will ever touch your hands. For the first time in years, he was speechless. His mouth opened, closed, then opened, again like a fish gasping for air. His arrogance drained out of him, leaving behind something raw and pitiful. He stammered, tried to protest, tried to tell me he didn't know, that he thought it was for my safety, that he cared. But I had heard enough. You showed me who you were when you thought I had nothing, I told him. Now you'll live with the fact that I have everything, and I chose not to save you. The silence that followed was thick, almost holy. It was not revenge that filled me, but release. For once, the balance of power was in my hands, and I didn't tremble under it. I stood taller in that chair than I had in years. Sometimes, losing everything is the only way to see who truly loves you. That day, I didn't just reveal a secret. I revealed myself, whole and unashamed. And now I turn this question to you. If you had the chance to show someone who dismissed you that you were far stronger than they imagined, would you take it? Or would you let them go on believing their lie? Tell me in the comments, because your answer may be the start of your own turning point. When the papers were signed and the silence between us had stretched into something colder than winter air, I knew what I had to do. The nursing home walls, once a cage I had accepted, now looked like nothing more than painted barriers. I was not going to spend the rest of my days in a room that smelled of bleach and boiled vegetables, waiting for visits that never came. I had the means now, and more. Importantly, I had the will. The next morning, before the staff even began their rounds, I sat at the edge of my bed and said it out loud to myself. I'm leaving. 2 words. Small, but they carried the weight of decades. Packing didn't take long, because what did I truly own here? A few changes of clothes, a photo of my late husband, a Bible with my notes tucked inside the margins, and a notebook where I had scribbled dreams I thought were too late to chase. That was it. My life in that place had been temporary, and I refused to give it permanence. When the nurse knocked and asked if I was ready for breakfast, I smiled, shook my head, and instead wheeled my suitcase into the hallway. Heads turned. Some residents whispered. Some clapped quietly. They understood. We were all women who had been placed here like fragile vases, hidden from the world. But in that moment, I became proof that we were not broken. I arranged everything in silence. The lawyer had already transferred funds into an account in my name alone. I had signed the lease on a small but beautiful apartment near the lake, and I had even scheduled movers to bring what remained of my belongings from the old house before my son could finalize his greedy plans. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. For the first time in years, I was choosing what walls would surround me, what bed I would lie in, and what view I would wake up to. When I told my son I was leaving the nursing home, his face shifted from disbelief to anger to something almost pathetic. He stuttered questions he wasn't entitled to ask. Where will you go? How will you live? Who will take care of you? The arrogance in those questions burned. He had forgotten that I took care of him for more than 2 decades, often working myself to the bone, just to make sure he had food, clothes, and a future. I looked him in the eyes and said, I will take care of myself. That's something you never imagined I could do. His silence told me he finally saw me, not as a fragile old woman, but as a woman who no longer needed him. Walking out of that nursing home was like walking out of a coffin that had been nailed shut while I was still alive. The sun felt different on my skin that day. The air carried a taste of freedom. I didn't go back to the old house. That place had been tainted by plans made without me, conversations whispered about my worth. Instead, I unlocked the door to my new home. The walls were empty, but they were mine. I ran my hand across the smooth paint and whispered, This is where I begin again. I filled that apartment not with expensive furniture or flashy decorations, but with pieces that reminded me of who I was before the world tried to erase me. A rocking chair, like the one I had nursed my baby in, a quilt my mother had made decades ago, and watercolor paints I had bought after years of telling myself art was frivolous. Each object was a declaration, I exist, I matter. My joy is allowed to take up space. My son, visited once, still shocked, still hoping I would change my mind. He tried to act remorseful, but his eyes still darted to the corners of the room, looking for what he thought he was owed. I told him calmly that I was willing to listen, but I was not willing to forget. Betrayal does not vanish with an apology muttered under pressure. He left that day without answers, and I closed the door behind him without tears. I sit here now, not in bitterness, but in clarity. I was treated like a burden, but I learned that dignity is priceless. No nursing home walls, no dismissive child, no cruel words can strip me of what I carry inside. The fortune I inherited is not the true wealth. The true wealth is knowing I survived, I reclaimed, I rose. So I turn to you now. Tell me, if you were in my place, would you give your child a second chance? Or would you let them live with the weight of their betrayal forever? I never thought the end of my story would look like this. For years, I believed my worth was measured by how much I gave, how much I sacrificed, and how much of myself I was willing to erase for the comfort of others. I believed that love meant silence, obedience, and carrying weight that was never mine to carry. But when the very child I raised decided I was no longer useful, when he looked at me not as a mother, but as a burden to be hidden away, something inside me broke. And in that breaking, I found the faith to rebuild. I remember sitting in that small room at the nursing, home, staring at the ceiling at night, whispering prayers I wasn't even sure would be heard. I asked God why I had given my life to raising a son who could discard me so easily. I asked if my life had lost its purpose, but slowly, as the days passed, I realized that purpose is not something others give us. It is something we carry within us. And sometimes it takes being abandoned to see that we were never alone. The same hands that guided me through poverty, through widowhood, through endless work shifts, were still holding me even when my son turned away. The inheritance I received was never just about money. Yes, the figure on that paper was staggering, but the true inheritance was trust. My late boss, who saw me as more than a housekeeper, more than a secretary, recognized my dignity when even my own family failed to. He left me not just funds, but a reminder that my presence mattered, that my voice had weight, and that my life was far from over. That was the confirmation I needed. God uses people, moments, even losses, to remind us that His plans are greater than the betrayals we endure. Walking out of that nursing home with my suitcase was not just an act of rebellion, it was an act of resurrection. I thought my story was ending there, surrounded by forgotten souls and fading days. Instead, I discovered that new chapters can begin at any age. I painted my walls in colors I loved. I planted flowers on my balcony. And I opened my Bible again with eyes that were not tired, but awake. Every verse I read now breathes life back into me. It tells me that I'm not defined by abandonment, but by grace. Not by rejection, but by resilience. Faith taught me that forgiveness does not always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it means letting go so we can live fully again. I do not know if my son will ever understand the weight of what he did. I do not know if he will ever feel the sting of his own choices. But I do know this: I will not let his failure define my future. I pray for him, yes, but I no longer live for him. I live for the woman I still am. The woman God created, with strength, purpose, and unshakable dignity. So if you are listening to this, and you have been discarded, overlooked, or treated as if your time has passed, hear me clearly. Your time is not over. You are not a burden. You are not invisible. You are not done. No matter what they say, no matter how they laugh, no matter who walks away, your story still has chapters waiting to be written. Stand up, take back your voice, and step into the life that is still yours. I was left in a nursing home to fade, but instead I rose to shine. I was called useless, but I found purpose. I was treated like a burden, but I discovered that dignity cannot be taken. It can only be surrendered, and I refuse to surrender it again. If my story has reached your heart, let it remind you of your own strength. There is faith that carries us when people fail us, and there is hope that breathes life back into what feels broken. And sometimes the very betrayal that tried to end us becomes the soil where our new beginning grows. So, if this story spoke to you, I ask that you like this video and subscribe, not just for me, but so more people can hear stories that remind them of their worth. And don't go far, because in the next video, you'll hear another journey of betrayal and transformation, one that will challenge everything you thought you knew about loyalty and love. Trust me, you won't want to miss. What comes next